of my fantastic cyber scientists out there. We are going to finish out our talk of the diversity of life, of which we've only barely started to scratch the surface, talking about the evolution of you, me, and starfish and sea sponges. Oh my goodness. The diversity and evolution of animals. So that is domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia. And the diversity within this kingdom is absolutely amazing. So, of course, this is a Muppet, but I put him here because he's called Animal. So let's just take a quick little overall look at the phylogeny of land on life. So you can see we've already talked about how plants are believed to have evolved from green algae, and all the algal groups share a common ancestor. And then these guys split off, and would you believe fungi are closer related to animals than they are to plants? Who would have thunk it, right? So anyway, we are going to concentrate on animals, and as you can see, animals are the newcomers in the tree of life. We actually haven't been around very long in the evolutionary scheme of things, and animals known as Homo sapiens, humans, we've been around really just in the last minute of the whole time scale of evolution. Incredible, yet what have we been able to accomplish in that minute? Oh my goodness. So let's look at some of the commonalities that make all animals animals. Like, oh my goodness, a sea sponge is an animal. How is that an animal, and you're an animal, and I'm an animal, and a starfish is an animal, and a goat is an animal? How does this all work? Well, there are some commonalities, and some of these commonalities are only apparent in certain parts of an animal's life cycle. So, incredible diversity. We're some of the most morphologically diverse kingdoms. That means different kinds of body types, different physical characteristics that you see out of all the diverse kingdoms on Earth. So all animals are what we call multicellular heterotrophs. So you remember that a heterotroph is something that eats other things. So in other words, we're not plants. We can't produce our own food through photosynthesis, right? We got to eat things that did photosynthesis. So we either got to eat plants or algae, or we have to eat animals that ate plants or algae, or animals that ate plants that eat algae. You get the idea, right? So we're all heterotrophs. We have to eat other things to acquire our energy. And all animals are multicellular. So this, for example, distinguishes us from the protists that we talked about before, things like the malaria parasite, right? Those were single-celled protists, kingdom protista. All animals, everybody in kingdom Animalia, are multicellular. And of course, our cells, of which there are many, have no cell walls. So plants have cell walls, fungi have cell walls. They're made of different substances, but cell walls nonetheless. Bacteria have cell walls. Animals, no cell walls. We kind of have these blobby, soft cells that only have a cellular membrane. But of course, we have organelles in our cells, and we have a membrane-bound nucleus. And here's one of the cool characteristics that define all animals. All animals are mobile. That means they can move in some way during at least part of their life cycle. So ponder this. A sponge, a sea sponge, is an animal. But you're like, well, sea sponges just sit there on a rock and don't do very much. Yeah, but you're looking at the adult animal there, the adult sea sponge. The juveniles are actually mobile larvae, and they swim through the water. How cool is that? And then they find a little spot in the rock, and they decide that that's a pretty cool place to live, and they become sessile. That means they're stuck in one place after that. Now, all animals also undergo sexual reproduction in at least one part of their life cycle. So some can also do asexual reproduction. So for example, aphids. Like, did you ever see the cartoon A Bug's Life? And remember the ant carrying around the aphid? Well, aphids actually are parthenogenic. The females can produce babies without the help of a male. Must be nice, right? So, but anyway, during part of their life cycle, they will undergo sexual reproduction where they do need males. But so all animals, at least partly, undergo sexual reproduction. And all animals have similar embryonic development. That means we go through the same stages of development as embryos, which is very interesting. And we've already talked about this when we played the Find the Human game in our evolution lecture. And all animals undergo cellular aerobic respiration. So recall, this is all about those mitochondria in your cells where we have to eat other things, right? We're heterotrophs. So we take in food And at the cellular level, we're going to be using this in the form of glucose, C6H12O6. You remember that, right? And all animals require oxygen gas. So we get our oxygen gas from the atmosphere, which was probably produced from plants or from phytoplankton or algae, some kind of photosynthetic thing. And photosynthesis gives off oxygen as a byproduct, which works perfectly because we animals need that to breathe in. So we take that oxygen, we take that glucose, and boom, through cellular processes, we get ATP, our energy currency that allows us to be animals and grow big and do all the cool things that animals can do, like grow amazing antlers like this guy right here. So what we're going to be really keying in on in this lecture are the key evolutionary innovations that animals had to evolve in order to become animals, in order to become large and do complex behaviors and all the other cool things that animals do. So we're going to be taking a look at adaptations animals have had for growing bigger, getting larger size, getting more complex, meaning having more complex physical adaptations, as well as things like mental capacity, evolution of the brain, hello, how cool is that? And increased mobility, activity, and in general, coping with all the challenges of having life on land. So this is a monophylogenetic tree. You've already learned about those. So we take this little guy down here. This is the common ancestor of all animals. And here are the diversity of all the critters in kingdom Animalia. Now, if you remember your Linnaean classification system, remember the mnemonic, dumb King Philip came over from Germany stoned? Well, we have domain, but a eukarya, right? We're all eukaryotes because we have organelles and a membrane-bound nucleus. Kingdom, Animalia, and then we get to the phylum level. So remember it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, it turns out there are quite a number of phyla within kingdom Animalia, and they're so incredibly diverse. And I want you to learn the main, more common phyla of kingdom Animalia. So we're going to start here, and we're going to have an activity that's going to help you to practice this, but not just memorizing who's in what phylum, but also what are the key evolutionary innovations that happened all along this phylogenetic tree. So I'm going to start with those key innovations, and then we're going to break this down, go into the different phyla, some of their key characteristics, and then I'm just going to show you some pictures of the amazingly beautiful diversity of all these phyla. And your challenge is, can you look at a particular picture of an animal and identify what phylum it's in? And in some cases, you'll also learn the particular class it's in. So for example, this guy up here, he's a human, right? That's Leslie Nielsen. And a human is, well, obviously he's domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, but he's in phylum Chordata, which means he has a backbone. So phylum Chordata. And you can actually identify his class too. He's class Mammalia because, you know, you and me, we ain't nothing but mammals. So this guy is in class Mammalia. So here you see a sea sponge. Here you see a jellyfish, a flatworm called a planarian, a nematode, a rotifer, a snail, earthworm, beetle, starfish, and Leslie Nielsen. So what is going on at all these different parts here? Well, let's take a look at the first three key innovations, key adaptations in the evolution of animals. So first of all, you might remember kingdom Protista that we've already talked about. And we said protists, which include the phytoplankton that, you know, photosynthesize in the oceans, but also include the zooplankton as some of the zooplankton, I should say, the protozooplankton, as well as things like algae and parasites like Plasmodium that cause malaria. So you can see that protists can be single-celled in the case of like malaria, or multi-celled in the case of something like seaweed, like algae. But animals are all multicellular. So clearly the common ancestor to all animals had to evolve, after that common ancestor evolved the innovation of multicellularity. Clearly there was some evolutionary advantage to being multicellular, to having multiple cells work together to create one larger organism. And that is really the key. Once you had that innovation, the multicellularity, boom, explosion of diversity that can happen, because now you have different functions. Different cells can take on different functions, and boom, evolution can tinker away and come up with some amazing adaptations. So the first group to arise, the most, quote, primitive animal group that we see to evolve multicellularity, we'll go over what we think is the most primitive animal living today in a sec, but let's just call the first group the sponges. And this is phylum Porifera, and we'll go back over this in a sec. So these sponges, they have multicellularity. So they have multiple cells all working together, some of them taking on different functions. But a very kind of primitive animal, it has no what we call symmetry. It's just a bunch of kind of cells just kind of stuck in there doing their thing. So if I were to slice a sea sponge this way or that way or that way, every part of that sponge would be different because there's no symmetry to the sponge. It just kind of grows however it grows. So no symmetry. And that can actually have some disadvantages when you think about it, because after that you see, boom, everybody else is evolved symmetry and true tissues. Because once you have that symmetry and you have the tissues, you can start having different parts of the body take on different roles. So for example, by the time you get to the most recently evolved group, the chordates like us, we have a head that all of our nervous tissue is now centered in this head, which can command other parts of the body. And we have organs that do different functions, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of the first key innovation that allowed the rest of the complexity of the kingdom Animalia to happen. Now, there's different kinds of symmetry, as we'll go over in a little bit. Some animals evolved what's called radial symmetry, where you could cut them like a pie. You know, if you take a jellyfish like this guy and you look down from the top, he's a circle. So you can go slice, 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 just like you're cutting a pizza or a pie, and each of those pie slices will be very almost identical to all the other ones. That's what we call radial symmetry. And that works for very simple creatures with simple systems, simple digestive systems, things like that, like this jellyfish. But as we had the need for greater complexity and more compartmentalization and higher nervous structure, we needed to have a better symmetry system. And this is where we get what's called bilateral symmetry. And that's where you can take an organism like us, zip, slice down the middle, and each of the two halves will be virtually identical, at least from the outside. And so you can see all these other animals here had bilateral symmetry. So there must have been something good about it, right? There must have been some advantage to being bilateral versus being radial, because boom, it took off, and we still see it very prominent today in even us. So these were some of the early innovations that were required for life on Earth and life on land to be an animal. And boom, then you see, once you have those key initial innovations, boom, we can evolve all this other stuff here. So, okay, now we're bilateral, which means we can more easily compartmentalize, so we can get the evolution of the body cavity. That means an internal compartment where we can start putting organs and having these organs take on different roles. So from a very kind of primitive form of this body cavity, we see these two phyla. This is a nematode, so it's phylum Nematoda. Again, I'll go over the phyla in a sec, so if I'm saying it kind of quick, don't worry. This is an interesting little phylum you don't hear that much about. This is Rotifera. That's a rotifer. These guys live in the water. Oh, and I forgot to mention the first group to experience bilateral symmetry was these guys, the flatworms, including this cute, cuddly planarian. I love planaria because you can actually like chop off their heads and they'll grow another one. It's so much fun in the laboratory. Anyway, so this is more the nematodes and the rotifers were kind of the primitive group for body cavity. But as these guys needed to get bigger and get more specialized, fill niches, become predators, etc., like that, we need more complex body cavities. And so you get the evolution of what's called a coelom. So we're going to talk about these things in much more detail here, but just to give you a quick introduction of what we're going to be talking about. So, and this coelom, you had the more primitive form of the coelom, which you see in the group phylum Mollusca, which include snails. And then we're like, okay, so now we need even more complex digestive system. So boom, gives rise to this other group here that includes us, that's going to have highly complex coelom in other words, a digestive system. And then, okay, now you have a body cavity, you have a coelom, a way of improving your digestive ability. So now we can grow bigger because we can get more nutrients, which means we need to move to more places to find food, and you get the evolution of segmentation. And this is really what allowed for very cool locomotion. It allowed us to move better. And so the first group to experience segmentation are things like earthworms. This is in phylum Annelida, and we'll talk about these guys. So yes, an earthworm is segmented. Weird, huh? You never thought about that. And from there, phylum Arthropoda, the arthropods, which include all the insects, all the crustaceans. Very successful group, right? Like you stick a cockroach in the microwave and he still walks out after being buzzed for a while. So anyway, clearly these are all very good adaptations because these guys have been very highly successful over evolutionary time. And finally, after that group, so these guys, like the arthropods, have an exoskeleton. They have a skeleton on the outside, soft body inside. Well, that works for those guys when they're small, but as you get larger, you have the effects of gravity, you need to move better. We get the evolution of the endoskeleton. That's like our skeleton, right? We have an internal skeleton. And boom, that obviously was a good invention because it took off, and you get the evolution of the chordates, including all the mammals like us, as well as this guy right here. This is starfish is in the phylum Echinodermata, spiny skins, and yeah, they have an internal skeleton. Who'd have thunk it, right? And then of course everybody else. So the last group, chordata, the chordates, which includes us, includes dogs, cats, all the other mammals, as well as reptiles, birds, fish. These guys are chordates, meaning they have a spinal cord, but we're going to call this the evolution of the notochord because the earliest chordates actually did not have true spines the way we do. Like we have these bony spines around a spinal cord. They actually just had something very primitive that gave rise to the full spine that we have, and that was called a notochord. So we say the evolution of the notochord led to phylum Chordata. Oh, information overload, right? Don't worry, because we're going to break this down. We're going to practice it. By the end of this, and by the time you've done your activity on this, my hope is that you will be an expert on all these phyla. So here's kind of a picture that depicts these guys. So these are the same pictures, the same kind of animals that we saw there, except instead of Leslie Nielsen, we have a hummingbird. So again, first innovation, multicellularity. And the first group in this, the porifera, sponges. So phylum Porifera, and they're called porifera because they're full of pores, little holes, right? And that's because these guys are filter feeders. They basically, water comes in, water comes out, and in the process they're filtering out all the little critters that provide them food. So they are heterotrophs because they're eating other things by filtering it. But they have no true tissues. Like, they don't have tissues the way we do. We have tissues like we have connective tissues and blood vessels and nervous tissue. They don't have that. They're basically cells kind of put together. Some of them have different roles from others, and they filter in water. That's kind of what a sponge is. But that's phylum Porifera. Then we get the evolution of true tissues and symmetry. So radial symmetry, we get things like the jellyfish. And so these guys are in phylum Cnidaria. Starts with a C, but the C is not pronounced, so it's Cnidaria. You also have a phylum called Ctenophora, also starting with a C. We'll talk about those guys in a bit. Those are the comb jellies, so very closely related. All these guys have radial symmetry. And then we get the evolution of bilateral symmetry, but the first group in here, the flatworms, like this planarian, these are platyhelminthes. That means flat. Okay, platy means flat. So these are the flatworms, platyhelminthes. No true body cavity. And then the evolution of the body cavity. So we're starting to differentiate different compartments inside our body, and this will allow for the evolution of a digestive system. And so the first guys had a very primitive kind called a pseudocoel, and we have phylum Nematoda. Nematodes, right? Roundworms. These are roundworms. You might be familiar with some of these guys, like heartworm, for example, that your dogs get. Those are nematodes. We also have lots of nematodes living in the soil, which actually help to break down things and recycle nutrients. So very important little group here. Some of these guys are parasitic and do bad things, but a lot of them are actually really good for us, good for the environment. So that's phylum Nematoda. And the other pseudocoels here are these little creatures, rotifers, phylum Rotifera. And again, they're just little creatures that live in the water. I'll show you some pictures. people don't usually think of these guys as animals, but they are. And then boom, once you have that body cavity, now we can evolve a true digestive system. And to do that, we need what's called a coelom. So we'll talk more about coelom. But the first group to have a coelom did not have segmentation of the body, and this is phylum Mollusca. These are mollusks, right? You guys know what a mollusk is, like clams and oysters and mussels and snails and octopuses, and squid. Those are all mollusks. And but you know, these guys don't have segmentations. Their bodies are very smooth, and they kind of just glide around and do what they do. Although octopuses are kind of, I mean, they're very highly evolved for a mollusk, and they can actually kind of do a walking. It's pretty amazing. But if you really want to get going and move faster than, for example, if you're a snail, you don't move that fast. If you're a clam, you don't move at all, really. Well, you do. They'll squirt, but you know, you can't really direct exactly where you want to go. If you want to be able to capture prey or hide from a predator, it's really good to be able to get out of the way fast, move fast, hide, all that kind of stuff, or zoom towards a food source if you're a predator. And so that's going to be a lot easier to do if you have movable joints. And so we get the evolution of segmentation. So we have the first group in this group are the Annelida. So phylum Annelida, these are your segmented worms. And I'll show you pictures of examples of these guys. And of course, very successful group. This is phylum Arthropoda that had jointed appendages and an exoskeleton. So these are all your insects and all your crustaceans. And some of you might like to eat things, crustaceans like lobsters and crabs and shrimp. And I'm sure you would be very happy to know that those are the ancestors of insects. So when you're eating a crab, you're kind of eating an insect of the sea. Yummy. All right. And then again, after that group, we have the evolution of an endoskeleton, an internal skeleton, the most primitive group being the Echinodermata, phylum Echinodermata. Echino means spiny, dermata, skin. So these are the spiny skins. And it's a very diverse group too. You're like, okay, sea stars, right? Starfish and things like that. But this includes groups also like sand dollars and sea cucumbers. How crazy is that? And finally, the evolution of the notochord, which gives rise to the spinal cord. So these are the vertebrates. So arthropods are invertebrates, so are mollusks. Chordates are vertebrates. So we are included in this group. Birds are included in this group. Mammals are included in this group. Okay, so Porifera, Cnidaria, Platyhelminthes, Nematoda, Rotifera, Mollusca, Annelida, Arthropoda, Echinodermata, and Chordata. These are all some of the principal phyla of kingdom Animalia. And there's a couple not shown on this, one of which we will talk about, which is phylum Ctenophora, which are the comb jellies. So we'll talk about those guys. Okay, real quick, let's talk about the fossil record and how we know from the fossil record some of these evolutionary trends. So it turns out most of these groups of animals are over 65 million years old. MYA means millions of years. And we start to see animals appear in the fossil record about 580 million years ago. We start to see microfossils, little guys, appear in the Dashantuo, boy, that one's hard to pronounce, Dashantuo collection of fossils that we see out there. So we start to see, for example, some animals, some eggs of animals. We start to see some fossils of sponges. And then we see between dated to 565 to 544 million years ago, the Ediacaran faunas. Faunas means animals. So these are from this particular collection of fossils that we see. We see more sponges and more complex kinds of sponges. And then we start to see fossils of soft-bodied animals like jellyfish and comb jellies. Okay, so this is kind of showing us, because as we're getting more recent in time, we're seeing more complex animals. And then the biggest collection of fossils that we find is in what's called the Burgess Shell. And I think you might have learned about this before. So the Burgess Shell was in, I believe it's around Vancouver, Canada, that area. It's just an area where there's a kind of rock called shell, and you can peel it off like pages of a book, and just tons and tons of fossils there. And these fossils are dated to 525 to 515 million years ago. And this is where you start to see fossils that go from having no symmetry, no true tissues, the sponges, to animals that clearly have bilateral symmetry, like this guy right here. So you could cut this guy right down the middle and both sides will look the same. So this is an example of a bilaterally symmetrical animal fossil that we see from the Burgess shell. So all that's great, right? The fossil records told us a lot about the evolution of animals, but thanks to modern technology in the last couple decades, nothing can compare to DNA evidence. So DNA evidence has totally confirmed what the fossil record already knew about the evolution of animals, which is what we just talked about. Okay, I did want to give you a little glimpse of what we think is the most primitive living animal today. And this little guy looks something like this, but a lot smaller. This is called a placozoan, and if you're interested, this is his species name, although shame on me, this should be underlined or italicized, as all species names are. So we think this is the most primitive living animal. This guy's only 3 millimeters in diameter. It's about like that, 3 millimeters. He's an animal 3 millimeters large. What a cute little guy, right? And what's cool about him is, like the sponges, he has no symmetry, and his whole body is only 2 cell layers thick. Wow, 2 cell layers thick. So you might say, wow, this guy's really primitive. There's no true digestive system. He kind of scrunches up, and he lives on the bottom of the seafloor. He just kind of goes along and does what he does. He has no true digestive system, so he basically goes over a food piece and secretes some enzymes which kind of break down that food, and then he just absorbs up the nutrients basically through diffusion. So very primitive little guy, but he does undergo both sexual and asexual reproduction. But he is multicellular, he has sexual reproduction, he basically qualifies as an animal given the criteria we went over before. So cute little guy, 3 millimeters, that's probably the world's smallest animal living. So let's talk a little more about these body plans. Just to review, again, the first kind of symmetry to evolve after the sponges, after phylum Porifera, is radial symmetry. And so you can take things like a hydra, which is this guy, and here's a drawing of him. And if you look down from the top, you can slice them like a pizza or like a pie. And so, for example, if you made, I think we have 6 or 7 different pie pieces here, each of these pie pieces looks the same. So that's called radial symmetry. Here's a sea anemone, and same thing, right? He has radial symmetry. So you can slice them and dice them, and each pie piece will look exactly the same. Okay, well, that works, right? If you're a hydra or you are a sea anemone, these guys are in phylum Cnidaria, and they have what's called a hydrostatic skeleton. So they basically use water to propel themselves through the sea. And so water comes in, water goes out. And so this works for these guys because they're floaters, right? They just kind of float through the ocean in their adult life stage. But as you get more complex in the evolution of animals, it's not good to have radial symmetry because you can't have a direction of where you want to go. If you have bilateral symmetry, you can get the evolution of what we call cephalization. That is the evolution of the head. Why is that cool? Well, if you have a head, you can evolve eyes so you can see where you're going, and you can evolve all your nervous tissue to be centralized in this hole in your head, and we call that centralized nervous tissue a brain. And by having a brain, you can think about where it is that you're going and think about everything else you want to do with your body. So without the evolution of bilateral symmetry, we couldn't have the evolution of the head. We could not have cephalization, and without cephalization, you can't get the evolution of locomotion to find more food, and without more food, you can't get better digestion and more nutrients so that you can grow bigger. In other words, we would still be things like jellyfish if it wasn't for the evolution of the bilateral symmetry. So, very important innovation right there. Okay, so we got our bilateral symmetry, which means now we have heads. We have the evolution of cephalization. Okay, so that means we can gather more food, right? We can go and find our food because now we can see it, we can think about it, so we can go to our food. Well, now as you're going to be able to get to more complex and more nutritious food, you have to also be able to digest that more nutritious food. And so we get the evolution of the gut. And so if you look at the, quote, more primitive animals, although I hate that word primitive, I'll just say the less recently evolved animals, so things like jellyfish or corals or anemones or the comb jellies, the ctenophores, these guys have a sac-like digestive system. These guys are also called diploblasts. Now, okay, a sac-like digestive system sounds cool, right? Well, let's think about this. If you have a sac-like digestive system and you're a diploblast, diplo 2, this means that you have an ectoderm, meaning an outer skin, and an endoderm, an inner skin. Well, you also kind of eat where you, your mouth is your anus. And so stuff comes in and stuff goes out of the same hole. Okay, if you're a jellyfish, that's probably fine, but you can see some obvious problems with that. For one thing, while you're eating, you can't be digesting and vice versa. And you're also going to be taking in a whole lot of bacteria at the time that you're eating. It's just not ideal if you're going to be a complex creature. So we want to evolve a more complete digestive system. And so we get the evolution of everybody else, and we're all triploblasts. That means we actually have 3 layers to our gut. So we have an ectoderm, an outer skin, an endoderm inside, and in the most complex creatures, including us, we also have a middle layer, a mesoderm. So what ends up happening is we have, our outer skin, and we have our organs inside, but those organs are actually coated with their own layer, their own protective membrane. And this is important because this actually helps these organs to not hurt themselves when they slide past each other. It helps to reduce that friction, which allows for greater movement, greater range of motion. And in us organisms with complete digestive systems, we have 2 openings, a mouth and an anus. In one way, out the other. Much nicer. Okay, so that allows us to digest and eat at the same time. It reduces the risk of infection. Just in general, it's a lot more efficient. It also gives a longer period of time where food coming in can go through convolutions of our digestive system. In other words, there's greater surface area for absorption of those important nutrients. So as you're absorbing more nutrients, as now your food has to go through this whole maze before it leaves, by absorbing all these new nutrients, this is going to allow organisms to grow larger. So if you can grow larger and you can extract more energy from your food, we're producing more ATP, you can do more activities. And those activities are things like finding mates, finding food, finding shelter, and thinking and doing all this kind of stuff, right? So those are all important adaptations. And so as you're growing larger and you're getting this complete digestive system, we want to start really compartmentalizing. We want different parts of our body to take on different roles. Okay, so we triploblasts evolve what's called a coelom and a peritoneum. And so this is, you may not know this, but all of our organs inside of our body are anchored by a membrane that's continuous. So for example, your liver, like let's say this lady right here, we're going to chop her in half, do what's called a transverse section, and you're looking down on her, and so this is her backside, this is her one of her spinal vertebrae here, right? This is her front side, this is called the posterior side, this is the anterior side, and let's say this is her liver. So the liver is actually in its own membrane, but that membrane is also connected to the gut cavity here, which would include your intestines, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of these organs, while being connected to each other, are also connected to the body wall. So this is what we mean by peritoneum, that there's this membrane that just connects everything together. And so this would be a coelomate organism, which includes humans. So the organs are lined with a membrane inside of this coelom, this body cavity. And so this is all really, really important. And you can see this is a triploblast because here's your ectoderm, right? What we call the epidermis is our skin. And this is your mesoderm. And then your endoderm are the linings of our organs, our viscera. Okay, so now as this person's moving around, these organs, as they're sliding past each other, are nice and slimy so they're not injuring themselves by hitting each other. So again, a lot more range of motion, able to do more things without causing problems. So the coelom and the peritoneum, they are anchoring and protecting the organs, allowing for better organ movement. Okay, well, now you got compartmentalization. You got these organs. They're all doing different things. You're being active. You're growing bigger. Well, in order to do this, you need ATP, right? Our old friend, the energy currency molecule. So to make ATP, you have to undergo aerobic cellular respiration in the mitochondria. And in order to do that, you need food and you need oxygen. So how are you going to get this food, glucose, and your oxygen around to all these compartments, all these cells making up these compartments? You're going to have the evolution of a complex circulatory system. In other words, we need blood vessels, arteries and veins and all their little tributaries that are going to bring this oxygen, bring the glucose to your cells so that we can rapidly get that stuff, that good stuff, into our cells, to the mitochondria to produce more ATP to do it all again. Okay, so we are going to get a lot more circulation of gases like oxygen, glucose. That's going to allow for greater movement, and eventually you get the evolution of complex structures like muscles, skeletal muscles, for example, that we can command with our brain to move and do what we need to do this extra activity, to get more food, to find mates, etc. Ooh, wow. So just to sum up, in the evolution of animals, in terms of the evolution of the coelom, we basically get three groups. We have the acoelomates. A means no. So these are the organisms, the animals that did not have a body cavity. So for example, flatworms like this planarian, I mentioned that you can cut his head off and he'll grow another one. But you can basically see, here's his gut. His tissues are kind of just there, and his epidermis. So no true digestive system. He kind of just throws it all in there. The pseudocoelomates, like this guy, this would be like the roundworms, phylum Nematoda. Pseudo means kind of, right? So they have an endoderm, like we have on our organs, and they have an ectoderm, and they have a mesoderm, but the cavity is not completely divided, so we call it a pseudocoel. And then finally we get the coelomates, which include us, which include birds, which include even the earthworms, the annelida. These guys have true division of their body cavities. So they have a coelomic cavity right here. They have their endoderm, a true mesoderm, and the ectoderm on the outside. So these guys have the body cavities that allow for differentiation and protection of organs, and that includes us. Okay, pre-quiz. Take a look at this. Which of the following is the circulatory system of a turtle? So we're going to start talking about the evolution of the circulatory system in animals, which is absolutely fabulous, fantastic, and fascinating. So, is this a turtle? Is this a turtle, or is this a turtle? So what we're looking at here is a diagram, cross-section of the heart, which is part of the circulatory system. So this would be our lungs, and this would be the heart. And so we have 1, 2, 3 chambers here. Is that a turtle? Or 1, 2, 3.5 chambers, because you have this little thing here called a septum, but it's not grown all the way up, so you kind of have 3.5 chambers here. Or, and this is the one that we have, a 4-chambered heart, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, means that this little division thing, the septum, has grown all the way up here to completely divide this into 2 chambers. Which of these is the turtle? Let's find out, because we are going to now talk about the evolution of the circulatory system, i.e. the transport highway of animals. Higher animals, not the lower animals. So jellyfish and sponges, they don't have a circulatory system. But as we grew bigger and we grew more complex and we got complete digestive systems, we had to supply glucose and oxygen to our thirsty and hungry organs. And so we get the evolution of a complex circulatory system. And the circulatory system is kind of the base of everything else that we are. If you cut off that circulatory system, everything else fails. Your respiratory system fails. Your excretory system with your kidneys fails. Your immune system doesn't work. You can't maintain temperature and body fluids and ions in your system. Your hormones stop working, so your endocrine system goes down, and your digestive system starts working. You have to have blood. We're kind of bloody creatures. If you don't have that blood system, everything else fails. So, how did this circulatory system evolve? Without the circulatory system, chordates like us would have never happened. So very interesting to study how this happened. Well, here are some of the key events in the evolution of animal circulatory systems. Well, the circulatory system had to co-evolve with our respiratory system, because what our circulatory system is doing is taking oxygen to all the cells of our body, all our tissues. And what it's taken is oxygen. So to get that oxygen, you have to have a complex respiratory system to breathe that oxygen in. And we know the waste product of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. So we have to breathe it out. And you need your circulatory system to take that carbon dioxide out of your body, which then the plants will breathe in. So the first most primitive animals, as we said, like these guys right here, these hydra, they have no circulatory system. They just use water to do what they need to do. And then in the arthropods, phylum Arthropoda, you start to see open circulatory systems. And we'll talk about these. It's very interesting. It's kind of a primitive circulatory system where they basically just kind of dump blood into the rest of the tissues. And that's, their blood is called hemolymph. They just kind of, it just kind of oozes through the tissues. But by the time you got the most complex creatures like all of these little beauties here, fish and salamanders and lizards, and of course the star-nosed mole, can't leave him out. These guys with increasing complexity, increasing size, increasing activity, we want to be efficient. We don't want to just dump our blood out into the tissues. It's not efficient, and therefore you can't grow big and do high activities. And so we get the evolution of the closed circulatory system. That means stuff comes in, stuff comes out. And we're going to describe how that happens. So, in the beginning, with things like the periphery, like SpongeBob here, there was no circulatory system. So this includes your jellyfish, your comb jellies, your sponges, your flatworms, and to an extent, even these guys. So these guys, some of these more primitive ones like these, they tend to be kind of flat organisms, and so they have a high surface to volume ratio. That means that the surface area increases faster than the volume inside, and so they're going to be flat and thin. And thus, they can use the process of diffusion to take oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. They have direct exchange with their environment, and that works for these guys because they're not that much activity. I mean, if you're a sponge, you're really not much activity. You're just kind of sitting there, and they don't do too much movement, and they don't do too much stuff. So for these guys, that works. They're not very large. But as we get more complex and we get larger, like check out this giraffe right here, there's no way that simple diffusion with the environment is going to get us the oxygen we need to grow as we need and do what we need to do. And so we get the evolution of the circulatory system because these guys have a low surface to volume ratio. That means that the volume increases faster than the surface area. And so we require more nutrients to transport through the body, more oxygen, and we excrete more waste. So we got to move this stuff. We need an information highway known as the circulatory system to be able to efficiently get the ATP that we need to do the activities that we do. So we require a lot more energy, a lot more ATP, and therefore need a circulatory system to get that oxygen around. So the next step after no circulatory system is a very inefficient circulatory system called an open circulatory system. So this is most of the invertebrates. This is the insects. This is the mollusks. This is, some of these like more, quote, primitive guys. And basically they do have kind of a heart. So some kind of little pump. It's a very, very primitive heart. And basically what they want to do is take in oxygen and deliver it through blood called hemolymph to all the organs of the body. But they just kind of just put it out there, let it ooze through the tissue. And so we can call that a hemocoel. So this, because they're little, because these tend to be, you don't really see like a 500-pound insect. Insects are little. And so, and in fact, they're very, they're kind of slow. In fact, they don't really move at all until the sun comes up during the day and warms them up. So they're cold-blooded creatures. But because they're little and they have an open circulatory system, that means that their hemolymph is under low pressure. That means it's not being pushed through. It's under low pressure because it's oozing. And so, they tend to be kind of slow until they get going. And because they're slow relative compared to like a vertebrate, they need less oxygen and less nutrients. And so their cells just get bathed with the hemolymph and the oxygen diffuses in. But like this guy, right? So this is a crustacean. He's an arthropod. So he's good with just an open circulatory system. But by the time you get to, oh, here comes, see what I mean? These guys are really slow. They come in here really slowly because that works for this snail. But by the time you get to creatures like us, just letting this, imagine these little things are oxygen, just letting these guys ooze through the tissues is not going to be enough. And so we get the evolution of a closed circulatory system. So all vertebrates, including us, and including some invertebrates like the cephalopods, which are the octopi, the octopuses, and the earthworms, the annelids, these guys do have closed circulatory systems. So you first see these circulatory systems in the octopus and in the earthworms, and then taken off in the higher vertebrates, like all these cute cuddly guys right here. And so the trend is going from one circuit that we saw in the insects into two separate circuits where we have oxygenated blood going to the tissues, and once the cells of those tissues have used that oxygen for cellular respiration, the waste product is carbon dioxide, and so the carbon dioxide then gets taken by the blood back out of the body through exhalation from the lungs. And so basically we get the evolution of from one, what we call atrium, that's the top chambers of the heart that we see in the more primitive animals, to the evolution of two separated atria, and from one bottom chamber that we call the ventricle to two separate ventricles. Okay, so like the fish basically had a little more primitive heart system and circulatory system than the higher vertebrates that you see here. So I'm going to attempt to kind of show the evolution of the heart in the earliest vertebrates, which were the fish. So this is an anglerfish. He's absolutely awesome. So fish live in the water, right? Last time I checked. So they live in the water. Therefore, they don't have the pressure of gravity as much on them because they have buoyancy. So if you have buoyancy, you don't have to spend as much ATP to hold yourself up. And if you don't need as much ATP, that means you don't need as much oxygen to produce the ATP. So you're good with kind of a simple heart. So these guys have one upper chamber called an atrium. So one atrium and one ventricle. And here's kind of how their evolution happens. So again, imagine this little dot here is an oxygen molecule being taken by a hemoglobin protein through the blood. And you can see that their oxygenated blood goes through one system, the arteries, into the capillaries. And then the deoxygenated blood, the carbon dioxide, is going to be taken back through this heart and out again. So oxygenated in, deoxygenated out. So the heart of these guys, one atrium, one ventricle, very, very simple, very primitive. But then as fish came out onto land, they needed to breathe air, number one. But two, suddenly they have this issue of gravity. And so they're going to need more energy, more nutrients, more oxygen. And so a two-chambered heart, one circuit is not going to fly anymore with these guys. So after the fish, we had the evolution of amphibians. And so these guys have two circuits. That means they're actually separating the path of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood and three chambers of the heart. So they get two atria, one ventricle. So if this is their heart, there'll be two separate atria, a right and a left. There's the right one, there's the left one. You're basically looking at the front of the frog here. And the ventricle is just one open chamber here. And so you have two separate circuits. We have what's called, in the amphibians, it's called a pulmocutaneous circuit. That means it's kind of a mix between using lungs and using your skin to breathe. So amphibians like frogs and salamanders actually can breathe partly through their skin. How cool is that? And so what's going to happen, they breathe in through their lungs and through their skin. Little capillaries, little blood vessels take that oxygen in, and so you're in this pulmocutaneous circuit into the left atrium, through the one ventricle, and boom, out through an aorta to the rest of the body. So this is the systemic circuit here. So you have a pulmocutaneous circuit and a systemic circuit. The cells of the systemic circuit use up that oxygen and unload carbon dioxide, which goes through the venous circulation here and into the right atrium down to the ventricle and out what's called the vena cava, and they breathe it out through their lungs and their skin. So two circuits, three chambers in the amphibians. Now let's get even more complex and larger. Bum-ba-dum. We got the reptiles. Now reptiles, the quote more primitive reptiles, still have two circuits, three chambers. But the higher reptiles, such as the crocodiles and alligators, who have been totally successful, right? They've been around a long, long time. Well, they're very complex. They're very fierce predators. They have to be able to think. If you've ever played with an alligator, I've been on an alligator swamp tour. Trust me, these guys can think. And so you're going to need a lot more ATP, which means you need a lot more oxygen, which means you need a lot more nutrients, which means you need a more complex circulatory system. So what these guys have done, how clever is this? They've taken that one ventricle that was in the amphibians, and they start to grow some tissue that separates that ventricle into two halves, and that tissue is called a septum. A septum means separate, basically. And they get a full, complete set of two circulatory circuits. So they get a pulmonary circuit and they get a systemic circuit. And now these guys are totally separated. And you're like, okay, why bother to separate this ventricle? Well, think about it. Let's go over this circuit again. I don't know if you guys can watch these. Again, imagine these are, I won't get stuck, but imagine this is your oxygen molecule here. You breathe it in through the lungs. These guys can't breathe through their skin like the amphibians could. The reptiles cannot breathe through the skin. So they're breathing in oxygen through their lungs. That oxygen is going through the pulmonary circuit. That means the lung circuit. Comes into the lungs, enters the left atrium of the heart, goes into the left ventricle, and now instead of that oxygenated blood being able to mix with deoxygenated blood coming off, it's separated mostly. This is like a partial septum, and that's important because that's more efficient. If you're not mixing your oxygen with your carbon dioxide, you're going to be a lot more efficient at getting that oxygen into your cells. And so that oxygenated blood then enters the aorta, down into the systemic circuit where it's bathing all of the cells of your body. And then the carbon dioxide, as a byproduct, a waste product, is sent through the venous system into what's called the inferior vena cava, through the right atrium, right ventricle, which is almost completely separated from the left, but not completely in these reptiles, and then out what's called the superior vena cava back to the lungs. So that is this two circuit system of the reptiles. But again, the higher reptiles are starting to get a division of the ventricles into two ventricles. The lower reptiles still allowed for that mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So the crocs and the alligators, much more advanced evolutionarily in terms of their heart and their circulatory system. So we need, as you get more complex, as you get bigger, as you get to do more activities and think, you need to be able to keep that oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood separate to be more efficient, produce more ATP. So finally, we get us, right? We get the complex vertebrates, the mammals and the birds. And yes, birds and mammals are different classes. Birds are class Aves, we are class Mammalia, but we're complex creatures. We have colors, we have behaviors, we grow big, we do all the cool stuff that we do. So you want to make sure that oxygenated blood and that deoxygenated blood are completely separate from each other so you can be the most efficient possible at getting that oxygen into your mitochondria so you can produce as much ATP, as much energy as possible. And so we have the highest energy demand. So our hearts have evolved to have two completely separate atria and two completely separate ventricles, because this septum has grown completely up here to divide the ventricle into two separate chambers, two ventricles. And so here are our two circuits. So our lungs, we breathe in our oxygen, the hemoglobin takes it through the lungs to the left atrium of the heart, down into the left ventricle, pumps it out through here, this is going underneath here, into our aorta, which then pumps it to the tissues in the rest of our body. Our cells use that oxygen to make ATP and produce the waste product of carbon dioxide, which enters our venous system. So by the way, the oxygenated system is our arterial system, the arteries, right? And the deoxygenated is the venous system, the veins. And that oxygen is then going to enter through two methods, through what's called the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, entering into this right atrium, down into the right ventricle, and pumps that deoxygenated blood out, boom, ba boom, into the lungs to be breathed out as carbon dioxide. How cool is that? Watch that oxygen go. Look at these two separate circuits. Just watch that for a minute. Dun, dun, dun. Might make you a little dizzy, but see how that oxygen goes versus how the deoxygenated blood goes. It's so cool. Okay, as if that wasn't cool enough. You guys have already learned about evolution. You've done MEGA. You've seen how similar at the DNA level all life on Earth is, especially within the animal kingdom. We're so similar. And sometimes, we've already talked about atavistic structures. Sometimes you see things pop up in higher animals like humans, and you start to see once in a while an individual born that reflects the conditions of a previous ancestor. So just to summarize the evolution of the heart, okay, the frog, right, we said he's 3-chambered, and the more primitive lizards have 3.5 chambers, and turns out the turtle is like the crocodile, to answer the pre-quiz before. So the crocodile and the turtle both have these 3.5 chambers where they have a partial septum. So we call this a septated 3-chamber heart. So 2 atria and 2.5 ventricles. So there's your turtle. And then you get to the vertebrates, the birds, and the mammals like us. And we have 4 chambers where we have a completely septated heart. We have the septum growing all up to divide the 2 ventricles. Okay, so that's what we said. But once in a while, a human baby is born with a disorder. It's very sad, called VSD. That's ventricular septal disorder. And in the case of ventricular septal disorder, instead of having 4 separate chambers to the heart, the septum that divided that ventricle does not grow all the way up. It's more like that of a turtle or a crocodile. And so that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is mixing, and as a result, the baby does not get enough energy, and so it creates problems for being able to stand upright for a long period of time. So usually the baby will have to get surgery to correct that septum. So here's a link to an article that describes this condition. And what's so cool is if you look at the DNA, like you did a mega analysis on this, you will see that the gene for creating a septum in the heart that a baby with VSD has is the exact same gene as what the crocodiles and the turtles have for creating a 3.5-chambered heart. So in other words, basically that human baby is reverting to the ancestral form of the gene. The DNA sequence is identical. Amazing. Sad, but evolutionarily, wow, right? Okay, so quick review. Let's go back to our guys here. So we talked about the different innovations here. So multicellularity, symmetry in tissues, bilateral symmetry, body cavity, coelom segmentation, endoskeleton, and notochord. So let's take a look at some of this beautiful diversity. This will help you practice these different phyla. So let's start with the sponges, porifera. Look at these beauties here. Look at the incredible diversity, colors, sizes. Yes, that is a sponge. It's an animal. Again, asymmetry, no true tissues. During their adult stage, they're sessile. That means they just sit there. Some encrust, meaning they're just kind of flat and lying over a rock. They can occur by themselves. They can occur in colonies. And they have these pores to allow for water passage. So these guys are filter feeders. They just kind of bring in plankton and other critters from the environment, and then they spit out waste. And their sex cells actually swim through the water. The sperm swim through the water. And so yeah, not much action going on there with those guys. But they have really cool cells. So if you look at the cellular level, here's a little piece of a sponge just to show you what you're going to find there. So here's the pore that allows the water in and out. And you'll see this row of what are called collar cells. These are choanocytes. And these guys have flagella, so they actually are capable of helping to pass the plankton and stuff through there. So they create a water current for these food particles to go. And they have little collars, almost like sieves that will help to trap these food particles. And then they also have things called spicules, and these are basically glass. They in a sense have silica. They have a glass shell. So if you step on a sponge, it kind of crinkles because you're basically breaking glass. Weird, huh? Enough of that. Let's just look how beautiful these guys are. We can study their intricacy. There we go. But check how beautiful. Look at this guy. Porifera. 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 There's an encrusting purple sponge. Porifera. Porifera, right? SpongeBob. So periphery are the sponges. They have pores because they're filter feeders. No symmetry. And now we get to the next group, the Cnidaria. So these are the stinging animals that include the jellyfish. They include anemones, things like that. So these guys actually have cells called nematocysts that sting things. So they're actually capable of stinging their prey. If you've ever watched Finding Nemo, remember that the clownfish like to live in the anemones and they go bzz, bzz, bzz. So, but they've actually become kind of immune to the sting of the anemone, and thus they're kind of protecting themselves from the predators. So these guys, they have a hydroskeleton, so they just use water to keep their form and shape. If you take them on land, they just turn into a blob of jelly, right? Hence jellyfish. But their digestive system is incomplete. Their mouth and their anus are the only way in and out. And instead of having a centralized brain, there's no cephalization. Their nerve net is just like their nervous tissue is just kind of everywhere. So they can actually sense the environment with their tentacles. They have some sensory cells in there in some of these guys, but beautiful. Beauty, mate. And these guys glow. So many of them glow at night. They have bioluminescence. How cool is that? Now, we said that Cnidaria have radial symmetry. And it turns out during their life cycle, they come in two forms. So the form you think of as the jellyfish, like this guy, is actually the adult stage. He's free-floating. He has the stinging tentacles, and he's kind of, just bobbing along like here. But the other stage of these guys is the polyp. And the polyp is sessile. It actually attaches to a rock. And what you're really looking at is the kind of the mouth of this jellyfish here. So he's still a jellyfish. It's just a different part of his life cycle. And his mouth and his anus are there, whereas when he becomes an adult, he kind of turns upside down. And what's so cool, scientists have recently discovered a species of jellyfish that lives forever. I kid you not. He just basically, he's a medusa, right? He's an adult. He's swimming around. And when something goes bad, he just decides to start all over again. He goes back to the polyp stage, grows up to a medusa, goes back to a polyp stage, grows back to a medusa. The fountain of youth, he found it. He lives forever. Imagine if we could harvest his genes, and who knows what we could do with that, right? Pretty amazing. And these guys are diploblasts. They have two tissue layers. So they have an epidermis, which is the outer, ectoderm. He's the outer body surface. And the gastrodermis, which is his internal body cavity where his primitive form of digestion occurs. Now, in terms of classes within phylum Cnidaria, the true jellyfish are kind of the poster child of this group. These guys are in class Scyphozoa. So zoa means animal. So Scyphozoa are the true jellyfish. And this is the medusa stage of this guy. Here's a couple bioluminescent ones. Oh, so beautiful. Boing, 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 if you remember Finding Nemo. Okay, the other class, typical class of Cnidaria, which looks a whole lot different than the jellyfish, but still Cnidarians. Genetically, they're very similar. And this is class Anthozoa. So the class Anthozoa includes the corals, right? The coral reef. Those are corals. They're animals. Animals related to jellyfish. Who'd have thunk it? The corals, the anemones, the sea fans and whips, and sea pansies. So check these guys out. Here's a coral. These guys are beautiful. But what you're looking at is the polyp stage. So these guys do not go into a medusa stage like the jellyfish. They're only polyps. And of course, the corals secrete a shell made of calcium carbonate. And they have a symbiotic relationship with algae called zooxanthellae. And so when we talk about issues of climate change causing bleaching of corals, what's really happening here is you're killing the zooxanthellae that are symbiotic mutualists with these coral, and that causes the bleaching of the corals. Okay, now here's another phylum, but closely related to Cnidaria. I mentioned these guys. These are the Ctenophora, starting also with a C. Why we have so many C's that are silent, I don't know, but Ctenophora, these are the comb jellies. Beautiful creatures. They do not have stinging tentacles, but they have sticky tentacles to capture their prey. So they don't sting them, they stick them. So no nematocysts, but they do have sticky tentacles. And they have 8 rows of beating cilia. And here's what's so cool. A lot of these guys live in the deep ocean, but at night, beautiful, gorgeous bioluminescence. And it looks like they're like waving colors going through. And this is because of these beating cilia. And I mean, just look how gorgeous these guys. These are comb jellies, phylum Ctenophora. Beautiful. Here's another ctenophoran or a ctenophore. Glowing. I mean, this is not Photoshop here. This guy's really glowing in the dark. Ha! Cool. Here's another one. Again, not Photoshop. This is what this guy really looks like. And I mean, I have to show you a video of this guy because, oh my gosh, he's beautiful. Here's another ctenophore. Beautiful. Okay, so we've talked about Porifera. We talked about Ctenophora and Cnidaria. Let's go on to phylum Platyhelminthes, where we start to get the evolution of bilateral symmetry. And these guys include groups like the flukes, the tapeworms, the turbellarians. And a lot of these guys are parasitic, a lot of these guys are not. The reproductive system tends to be highly developed, and you start to see the first kind of primitive brain to allow these guys to start going in particular directions. And these guys also get the evolution of 3 distinct tissue layers. And what you're looking at here are what are called nudibranchs. And these guys are some of my favorite animals on Earth. They're absolutely beautiful. This is a flatworm here. Let's look at some of these guys. So here's the group of flatworms, group of Platyhelminthes called the turbellarians, and they include the nudibranchs. They have eye spots, which aren't true eyes, but they're kind of primitive eyes because they allow you to perceive light and dark. Oh, they're so beautiful. I love these guys. Nudibranchs live in the ocean. They go along rocks and on the seafloor, and they just come in so many beautiful colors. They're just fantastic. I'm going to show you some more of these guys soon. Now, the flukes are a different story. These Platyhelminthes flatworms, platyhelminthic flatworms, the flukes, all of these guys are parasitic, and they do some major damage to humans. So some of their cool features, again, they're not necessarily good for us, but they're so cool evolutionarily. Look at this mouth part here. Chomp, chomp. This guy can actually latch on to the intestinal wall of a human and basically suck your nutrients. Evolutionarily awesome. In reality, not very cool for us. But all these guys here, these are flukes. You have liver flukes. You have all these guys. A lot of the larvae of these guys are present in fish, so be careful with your sushi and your sashimi. But here's an example of some flukes that do not so nice things for humans. This right here are two, actually, a female and a male schistosome. These little beauties here cause a disease in humans called schistosomiasis, and it can lead to death. And in fact, it kills about 200 million people around the world each year, or anywhere from 1 million to 200 million, or sorry. So this can infect about 200 million people a year, with causing the deaths of about 1 million people a year worldwide, usually children, because these little flukes here get into the bloodstream and they end up blocking blood flow to organs such as the liver. So it can cause cirrhosis of the liver, it can block bile passage. This person here actually has a variety of schistosome that affects the bladder. These girls here have a variety that blocks the spleen, and so they end up getting swollen bellies, which is what you see here. So the intermediate host of those guys, by the way, is a snail. So usually the way people get infected with schistosomes is they're walking barefoot on the bottom of like a creek bed or a river. Also in phylum Platyhelminthes, we have the tapeworms. And these guys are parasitic, and they basically live on the nutrients that the host is taking in. So they live in the intestine where they start sucking up all your nutrients. And anyway, often these have intermediate hosts, but these guys come in little segments. Each little segment is called a proglottid, but in a human, a tapeworm can be like 12 feet long. And yeah, so if you like have the sudden constant weight loss and you wonder why, they might check you for tapeworms because they could be sucking up all your nutrients and thus you're losing weight. I have a tapeworm story. I'll save it for the discussion board though. Anyway, so that was phylum Platyhelminthes. We have phylum Nematodes. These guys exhibit bilateral symmetry, and they're one of the first groups to have a complete digestive system. So they're actually seemingly primitive on the outside, but actually, in actuality, they're actually quite complex. And they have a waxy coating on the outside called a cuticle that helps to prevent dehydration. And here's just some more beautiful electron micrograph pictures of these guys. They're just amazing. And again, not all roundworms cause disease. Some of them do, but they're very vital to the proper functioning of the soil and, in general, the ecosystems. Phylum Annelida, these are our segmented worms, starting with the earthworms here. But actually, the most common type of annelid out there are the polychaete worms in the sea. And so I'll show you some pictures of those beauties. But some of the keys to these guys, they're the first to develop well-developed nervous systems. They have a brain, which is very cool. So these guys can go in a particular direction. They have the first group to have a closed circulatory system, like we talked about. And they tend to also perceive their environment. So they have these bristles on the side of the body so they can actually kind of anchor around and perceive their environment. So very beautiful. Again, they have complete coeloms, complete digestive systems. And thanks to the segmentation of these guys, we get the evolution of all the other animals. And so here are some polychaete worms that are in phylum Annelida. So we have the earthworms on land, but in the sea, the polychaetes are dominating this phylum. So it's the largest, most diverse group of annelids. They have a separate head, and some are carnivorous, some are deposit feeders, meaning they decompose dead things. And some of them as larvae are floating. They're planktonic. They float through the ocean, but the rest of the time they're sessile. They kind of sit. I mean, look at this guy. You'd think this was some kind of plant. No, he's not a flower. He's a polychaete worm in the ocean. How cool is that? And you'll find this guy on the coral reef. Here's another one. So many beautiful varieties. Here's some examples of phylum Mollusca, the mollusks. So these guys are the first to have kind of the basic body plan that we see in all the vertebrates. The mollusks kind of invented that, and that means that they have a head, they have a body, we call a muscular foot in these guys, and a visceral mass. That means an organ mass. And so some of these guys have what's called a mantle. In other words, they secrete a shell, and that kind of gives them a little house, right, like a snail shell. But it's also a depository for waste. It also provides an area for sensory reception and respiration. And the shells of these guys are made of calcium carbonate. So this actually has some significance for the development of the seafloor and sand and things like that, but that's for a different class like oceanography. The other thing about these guys is they have grazing mouth parts called radula. So they kind of go around, graze, chomp, chomp, chomp. Some of these guys are carnivores. Some kind of have a scraping pattern, like they scrape algae off of rocks. And some are deposit feeders, meaning they basically are decomposers. They decompose decaying stuff. These guys are the closest group related to the arthropods, so they also have an open circulatory system, yet they have a complete digestive system. So you're seeing a good digestive system, not such a good circulatory system. And here's a photomicrograph of those radula grazing mouth part, chomp, chomp, chomp. Who ever knew a snail was so complex, right? His penis is up near his head. Wow. Good thing that got modified over evolutionary time. But here's the digestive system. So you can see they have a digestive gland, his rectum's up here, etc. But what a cool creature, right? Everybody knows about snails. And they've taken to the land, they've taken to the water. Very cool. Here's another example of a mollusk that you might not be familiar with. This is called a chitin. And these guys are so much fun to play with, but they stick on the rocks so well. It's so hard to pry them off a rock. But if you get one off a rock, you can see that they have these segmented shells made up of 8 plates. This is called a dorsal shell. And they have this ventral muscular foot. Ventral means in the front. So muscular foot in the front. And if you stick them on your finger, they'll actually like suck the end of your finger. And then they start rolling up into a ball. So cute. So anyway, they graze on algae. But, you know, just to show you again some of the beautiful diversity of phylum Mollusca. And then, of course, you're familiar with this group of mollusks. These are the bivalves. So this class Bivalvia, and it includes your scallops, your clams, your mussels, you know, these two-shelled bivalvia, two-shelled creatures here. And this little part of the shell is called the umbo, And that's the oldest part of the shell. And then basically almost like a tree, these guys grow with these circles, kind of half circles growing out. And so you get these concentric rings growing out. These guys have muscles. They have little muscles called adductor muscles that help to close those shells together. And they can kind of squirt in water. They have things called siphons, which the water, they can kind of suck water in and then squirt it out. And that actually allows these guys to move through the water. So clams and scallops, they actually move, but not really with a direction. They actually have gills of a sort, and so you can see those there. And so they use that for respirating. And they're filter feeders. So kind of a primitive sort of a mollusk. Definitely took a different turn than the snails or the octopi did. So here are your snails. They're definitely more recently evolved than the bivalves. These guys are in class Gastropoda, which means stomach feet or belly feet. And so most of these guys have a coiled shell, although sea slugs, which basically are nudibranchs, do not. So here's a nice nudibranch there. I just can't get enough nudibranchs. I got to keep showing you nudibranchs because they're just so beautiful. Google image them. They're just gorgeous. And again, these guys had the evolution of this kind of cool mouth part, the radula. And then, you know, there's several of these guys in here. You've probably seen some of these guys around. But I had to make a collage of nudibranchs. I love them so much. I mean, hello, this is not Photoshop. This is the diversity of life on Earth. I mean, this guy's actually called the blue dragon. I mean, just look how beautiful these guys are. They live in the ocean. They're all mollusks. So phylum Mollusca, class Gastropoda. These guys are so incredibly beautiful. I mean, YouTube them, watch them in action. Now, the most, quote, highly evolved group of phylum Mollusca are the cephalopods. So class Cephalopodia. These are your octopuses and your squids. And the octopuses especially, these guys are by far the most intelligent invertebrates. I mean, they can do cool things like take jars off of baby food jars, childproof containers. They can leave one aquarium and go into another to get a clamshell that they see there. I mean, these guys are so cool. They have great eyesight. They have a really sharp, kind of evil beak that they can actually bite, and some of these guys actually bite, and their bites are toxic. And they have these tentacles with little suction cups, and they secrete ink for defense. I have an octopus story too that I also will save for the discussion board. And then here's the squid, and some of these squid can be 75 feet long. Living squid today, oh my gosh. I mean, you thought the 6-footers were giant. They could eat a human. Anyway, beautiful. I mean, these guys are so cool. Their brain, as you can see, is much more highly developed than it is in a snail. And there's their gonads. There's their stomach. Some of these guys can actually walk on 2 of their tentacles. I'm gonna put a link to a beautiful gastropod. I mean, not sorry, gastropod, cephalopod for you guys. And of course, as you know, cephala means head. So these are head feet. And that's because these guys have amazing heads. They're very, very intelligent. They're kind of almost like the humans of the invertebrates. They're really cool. This group also, in addition to squid, includes the nautilus and the cuttlefish, which you might have heard about. Here's another beautiful octopus here. They also come in all sorts of beautiful shapes and sizes. So here's the squid, and I'm not going to bore you with all the internal anatomy of a squid. You can dissect one, but you can see their brains are not quite as fancy as that of an octopus. But they also secrete ink, and their jaw, I mean, these guys actually have a very well adapted biting mouth part there. But some of these guys are also bioluminescent. They glow in the dark. Okay, we're getting there. Phylum Arthropoda. So phylum Arthropoda, these are the arthropods. And you have class Insecta, which are all insects, but you also have what used to be called class Crustacea. Now it's called subphylum Crustacea. But this includes your crabs, your lobsters, your shrimp, and just like the insects, all arthropods have an exoskeleton made of the polysaccharide chitin, which happens to be the same thing the cell wall of bacteria and fungi are made out of. Interesting, huh? We don't always reinvent the wheel. And these guys grow by molting. So they basically shed a shell and grow another one. So you may have seen this with insects. They actually, instead of growing gradually the way like a mammal does, they actually grow in spurts. And so one stage, once it sheds its shell, will look completely different than the next one. It's quite fascinating. But again, these guys had the evolution of the jointed appendages, so they can move much easier. And of course, they have highly evolved heads. They have highly evolved body plans in general, head, thorax, abdomen. And of course, a complete digestive system, but an open circulatory system. They do have specialized organs, so they can sense light and dark. They can sense where food is. Anyway, in general, and they evolved internal fertilization, so they actually deposit sperm inside of a female. So very interesting. And let's look at some of the diversity of these guys. So, of course, your lobsters, copepods, which are actually the most by mass numerous animal in the ocean. Spiders, which are arachnids, right? Horseshoe crabs, which have been around for many millions of years. These are all arthropods, but so are the insects. So class Insecta, I mean, check out this beauty here. This is a praying mantid adapted to camouflage against the orchids he sits on, and he moves like an orchid in the wind, which is really cool. Here's another picture of him. Beautiful. Put together all you've learned about natural selection and evolutionary processes to figure out how this guy ended up evolving to look like the flower he's on. Here's some more insects, butterflies. Here's a monarch butterfly, which is kind of toxic to birds, and the viceroy butterfly, which mimics this monarch butterfly, yet he's actually perfectly edible and tasty to a bird. Or here's a fly that mimics a yellow jacket. How cool is that? This one, class Insecta, is amazing. They have some of the coolest camouflage and mimicry adaptations. Here is a caterpillar that mimics a snake. Okay, he might startle a bird, right? But some of the others in his group, holy moly, check this out. And this. That is a caterpillar. I mean, it would fool me. Of course it's going to fool a bird. What it's actually doing is you're looking at the underside of the abdomen of the caterpillar, and he's taken his end here, puffed it up, two spots that look like eyes, and he actually hisses and moves back and forth like a snake. But he's a caterpillar. How amazing is that? Okay, well, phylum Arthropoda we could spend years on, but we don't have time. I know you guys are probably waiting for this lecture to end. So let's quickly go through the last two phyla. Phylum Echinodermata, the spiny skins. These guys were the first group to evolve an endoskeleton like us, right? You know, knees, toes, you know, them bones. Yeah, these guys have an endoskeleton. It's quite different from ours, but nonetheless, it's saying let's support our tissues from the inside instead of having a crunchy exoskeleton. These guys have a complex vascular system for dealing with the water. They have tube feet, meaning these kind of little suction cup feet that help them get around and also can sense prey and they can feed with it. Their gills are actually in their skin, so they can actually, in a sense, breathe through their skin. And their symmetry is very peculiar. It's a little crazy because for like a starfish, as larvae, he's bilateral. And then he sort of takes on this more radial looking symmetry, although he's not perfectly radial. But you could get confused because if you look at another kind of echinoderm, a sea urchin, yes, sea urchins are related to starfish. How is that? Weird. Well, anyway, as larvae, they're bilateral, but as adults, they're radial. Huh. And these guys have a decentral nervous system. So evolution's been tinkering. Okay, we had a centralized nervous system with things like the octopi, but let's try decentralizing it again and see how that works. Well, obviously wasn't the best because we went back to a centralized nervous system with the chordates like us. These guys, you can cut off their arms and they'll grow another one. I mean, check out that guy. Beauty. And here's some more. So here, look at the diversity just of sea stars. And sea stars are so cool. Not only can they move with these kind of tubular feet, so they've learned a new kind of locomotion, but they have a central disc in the middle, which is kind of cool. Calcium carbonate plates on their skin, which makes it kind of spiny. And these guys are all carnivores, so they eat things. And in fact, you may not have known this, in the coral reef, or at least in the rocky intertidal zone, like off the coast of California and Washington State, the top predator in the rocky intertidal zone is a starfish. How cool is that? Well, related to starfish, other echinoderms, these are brittle stars. So they're a lot like starfish or sea stars, except they have these thin arms here. They have an internal organ called a central disc, and you know, they eat with their feet. That's cool. Very beautiful. Now here's some echinoderms you wouldn't think of being related to starfish, and those are, well, we already said the sea urchins. So sea urchins are related to starfish. They're echinoderms. But other things like sand dollars and sea biscuits, these are all echinoderms. So, you know, they have like rigid plates. The anus is on the top and the mouth is on the bottom, which is kind of crazy. And inside, they have something called an Aristotle's lantern. And, you know, dissecting one of these is beyond the scope of this course, but when you dissect one of these guys, you'll find Aristotle's lantern, and that's where the mouth is, where he actually grazes. Really, really cool creatures. And not only that, also in Echinodermata are the sea cucumbers. Sea cucumbers. There's a joke about a sea cucumber from Finding Nemo, but I'm not sure he ever actually finishes the joke. Anyway, beautiful diversity in the sea cucumbers. Sea cucumber, sea cucumber, sea cucumber, sea cucumber. Beautiful. Now, these guys have 5 rows of 2 feet, all on one side. Their skin is kind of softish. It's not like a sea star. And they're deposit feeders. It means they go along the bottom looking to just munch on whatever decomposing stuff they find. But the really cool thing about these guys is evisceration. Evisceration, these guys can actually take their internal organs and they just basically expel them. And this is actually a defense mechanism, because the idea is that if they're startled, if you can regurgitate out, throw up your organs, that's going to distract the predator while you get away, and then later on you can grow back your organs. How cool is that, right? Pretty cool. Okay, on to the last phylum, Chordata. These are the chordates, and this is the group that you're in, and I'm in, and your pet dog is in, and your pet bird is in. Reptiles, fish, we're all chordates. So chordate characteristics. These guys have a no-toe chord. So the most primitive chordates actually were not vertebrates. They were invertebrates. They are invertebrates. So these are your tunicates and your lancets, like this guy. And you can see he has basically a very primitive nerve cord, and this is his notochord right here. So he has gills. He's basically a fish, but has not evolved the bones around that notochord. So he is really the first chordate, the first guy to give what will become the spine in higher vertebrates. So Chordata includes invertebrates, tunicates, and lancets. These are all fishy-like creatures. And the vertebrates, which are the fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And so all these guys right here. So us chordates, we have notochords. In the higher vertebrates, that is a spinal cord, and a nerve cord, and a muscular pharynx. That means our throat. A pharynx is your throat, and you have muscles around it. So if you swallow, we can actually move stuff down there, right? And we have gill slits. Now you're like, wait a minute, I'm a human, I don't have gill slits. Well, we might have mentioned this before. During embryonic development, we have gill slits, and those become gills in fish, but they close up in mammals. And so you end up with a pharynx with no gill slits. But once in a while, somebody's born with open gill slits, and they have to have surgery and get them closed. How cool is that? We have a post-anal tail, and again, humans, yes, we do have tails as embryos, which usually enzymes will eat it away before birth, but not always. Some people have tails. And a ventral heart means our heart is kind of in the front of our bodies. And here are the tunicates. So these are some primitive chordates. They're better known as sea squirts. Look at these beautiful creatures you'll find on a coral reef. And these guys are so cool. They basically, you know, take water in, squirt water out. So they have a siphon. Kind of reminds you of some other groups, but they have beautiful diversity. And really, as larvae, they are chordates. That's where you get these characteristics of the notochords and things like that. But if you saw them as adults, which is what you see here, you would never know that they're very close relatives to humans. How is that? Well, because in the adults, what you're really looking at is the pharynx, which is the throat in us. Only as larvae do they exhibit all these other characteristics that we vertebrates do. So they have a kind of a thick outer coating, and that's called a tunic, and hence they're called tunicates. They're broadcast spawning. Basically, they take their gametes and go out into the water, and hopefully sperm and egg will mate, and they'll become a new tunicate. So those are the most primitive chordates, the lancets and the tunicates. So these are your lancets here, and some of these guys, they're kind of like fishy things, but they're actually invertebrates, and they just stick out of the sand. Very cool. So you find them in shallow marine waters. They're real small, about 3 inches long, and they do have muscle tissue, segmented muscle tissue, and basically a nerve, a notochord that will attach to some simple muscles. And they have gills, but they basically filter feed instead of using their gills for respiration the way fish do. So the adults of these lancets have the features of a chordate, just like the rest of the vertebrates do. So whereas the tunicates, only the juveniles exhibit the characteristics of chordates, but for lancelets, they maintain those characteristics throughout their life. And finally, the rest of the chordate phylum, us, dogs, bunnies, chicks, other kinds of birds, the gecko guy, the diversity of vertebrates goes on forever. But again, the characteristic of these guys, all those other beautiful innovations, plus a notochord that in these guys is often called the spinal cord or the spine. So much about animals, so much more we could go into, but this is just an introduction to the basic innovations and evolution of the animals. Kingdom Animalia, absolutely awesome. And you and me, baby, we are in class Mammalia. Hope you enjoyed it, and take care.